Okay, so this is an application of all that we talked about just in the last video. Here we're going to look at actual island colonizers, what happens with the various species. So what you see here is you see land mammals that are non-flying, right? Would find it difficult to get to an oceanic island. So what we see is we often see that there are very few land mammals on isolated oceanic islands. So in places like the Galapagos, you're not going to see a lot of those land mammals. Now, why? Because to be stuck in the ocean for 800 kilometers, even with the fastest winds and currents, it might take a week to get to the island. And so mammals have a high metabolism that would find it difficult to survive that long trek. And then to be found in multiples of two or more on an island, again, it would be difficult without some type of man-made transport for these animals to get to these oceanic islands. Reptiles have a slower metabolism, so they can stand on driftwood or mats or floating vegetation, and their metabolism is slow enough that they might be able to last several, a couple weeks on the ocean currents to get to the island. Again, most of them are probably going to die in the ocean, but at least a few could make it. And that's all you'd need is just a few of them. Small birds, bats, insects, etc., often can be blown onto an island. So you see a lot of these seabirds can fly from island to island. Albatrosses have been known to be found flying over open ocean. So an albatross can glide and fly. It's a seabird that flies fairly long distances, and mariners or ocean-going humans have long since seen these birds fly in the open ocean. In fact, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner in 1834 was written by a man named Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and it's a famous poem. Maybe some of you read in English class, but often albatrosses were considered as omens as to whether good luck or bad luck for the mariner. I couldn't tell you, but they were so often seen that they became part of the mythology of ocean-going humans. So small birds could get blown onto the islands. Seabirds could have made nests on the islands, again away from any predators. Sea mammals obviously could make it to the ocean. Sea lions, seals. You could see walruses on Arctic islands. There's plenty of examples of seagoing mammals making it to islands. And of course, crustaceans of all kinds, crabs, etc., could find niches on these islands. And in fact, we find some species that are rarely found anywhere else on various islands because they've been isolated genetically for such a long period of time, and they've been able to fill in niches that weren't in existence on the mainland. So amphibians would find it difficult to make it, and you often don't see them on oceanic islands because they don't really survive well away from fresh water, since amphibians are have generally evolved to take advantage of the freshwater niche. Oceanic reptiles like the seagoing iguanas, marine iguanas are reptiles, not amphibians. So, again here, the giant tortoises of the Galapagos Islands have a long history with the islands. In fact, the island Galapagos itself is named after them, since it's a Spanish name for tortoise. So when we take a look at when we say giant, I mean they're big. There are several different species. One actually ended up going extinct just in 2012. Lonesome George, the last of his kind, went after he died. His species went extinct. There's the last Pinta Island tortoise. Now, what's interesting is that each island, because these tortoises found their way to these islands, several million years ago, and we know that from both the fossil records and genetic data. You have the different islands developing different types, different species of tortoises that obviously normally don't mate with one another. So these giant tortoises can be found on the island chain, but different islands have different species. In fact, of the remaining species, 15 different species that remain in the Galapagos Islands, there's 20,000 individuals. The Galapagos Islands are protected now from mariners who would have eaten the tortoise for fresh meat, which you can't really blame them. They're on the ocean for months at a time without any fresh meat. They've only had salted beef. And so when they landed on these islands, they saw meat as a source of nutrition. They took advantage of that. However, that also caused a collapse in the ecology as the various tortoises started reducing in population size to the point of being endangered. But since the Galapagos Islands have been protected, their numbers have improved. Except for Lonesome George, since Lonesome George was the last of his species, there was nothing else that could be done. There was no female for him to mate with. Global climate change is still risking the islands, the biological diversity that we find in those islands. Now, again, you have a really perfect combination for evolution on these islands. They're isolated islands. They're isolated from the continent. They're isolated from each other for the most part, especially for the land animals, the birds perhaps not so much, and insects. But for the land animals, the land reptiles, and for probably that's about it. The land mammals, they're pretty isolated. Land reptiles are pretty isolated on these islands, and so you would expect there to be some various pretty good diversity from island to island, and that's what you find as each one fills in a niche through adaptive radiation. I believe after all this, you should be able to answer these questions. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm sure you could read them on your own, whether you're reading them in your handout or on the PDF that you downloaded or on this version here. I think you can read that. These are the factors that affect the biota, right? The biota meaning the populations of life on the various islands. Like, why is it that this island has this kind of animal, perhaps a saddleback giant tortoise versus a non-saddleback giant tortoise? Why are there 15 different species of tortoises on these islands? So obviously, isolation is going to be a big thing. You have to have the population stay isolated, because every time an individual comes in and submits new genes to the population, you mix those genes up into the population. So it's hard for us natural selection to select a set of genes if you continuously bring in new genes into the population. So having a population stay isolated over time allows for a better chance of what we call speciation, right? The creation of a new species. That's going to impact what the population looks like. So, all right. So a good example is if you have blue flowers and you have pink flowers on one island. All right. So let's just think about it for a second. If you have one island that has, let's just use red flowers. Another island has blue flowers. And some red, but mostly blue. If these all keep having babies with one another, you'll see less and less red flowers unless natural selection comes in. If something selects the red flowers and kills all the blue flowers, then the next generation is going to be all red. But if there is no difference, if the gene is neutral, red and blue continue to be evenly chosen, right? So red or blue doesn't make a difference for survival of the young, and survival to the point where they can have young, right? So as long as they can survive and have babies, and the babies can have babies, let's assume that that's what's going on here. Then because there's more blue over time, you'd see more and more blue and less red, right? So these genes will be in the population, but they're going to stay at a very low frequency. Here, there's only red. So as long as it stays red, as long as there's no other genes come into the population, you're going to see only red. And the longer it stays isolated, the longer these just keep having sex with one another, and the genes keep flowing within the same subgroup, this island, right? Since if no other genes are coming in and none are going out, then these genes, if there's no gene flow, that's what we call gene flow, right? The flow of genes in, the flow of genes out. So if the longer it stays isolated, the better chance you have of these genes finding themselves on different chromosomes, in different mutations. Maybe other mutations start to affect how, this is color right now, just color, but perhaps they start to change their structures. Perhaps the way they have, the way they pollinate one another changes. And so over time, this can become a completely new species. You can't even cross-pollinate them, assuming that they stay isolated. But even if one of these pollen grains gets blown over to this island, or gets taken over by a seabird or what have you, and comes into this population, or blue goes from this population to this population, then all of a sudden you have genetic recombination. And the species can continue to be the same species, but with different genetic variation percentages, depending on luck, right? Depending on genetic drift. You can have a different gene combination in each one, but it's difficult, if not impossible, for them to be a different species, since they're continuously sharing genes. There's continuous gene flow between the two populations. Once you stop gene flow, once you stop genes from going from one population back and forth, and you isolate them for a long enough period of time, they become more and more different, whatever that different looks like. And as those differences continue to mount and become more and more different, over time they become a different species. But it takes a long time for that to happen. The tortoises first landed on the Galapagos Islands. Well, generally it takes a long time. It can happen quickly, but it generally takes a long time for it to occur. So a tortoise on the Galapagos Islands, the giant tortoises, they became 15 different species. But remember, they first got there 15 million years ago. How long did it take them to become different species? I'm sure maybe someone knows. I don't, but it took a long time. All right. So degree of isolation. How isolated are they? How long have they been isolated? So maybe they're completely isolated. Maybe no other genes come in or leave from the island because they're so far away from all the other islands. Or maybe just that occasionally some genes go back and forth. If they occasionally go back and forth versus every 1,000 years go back and forth, that's a big difference. Again, the length of isolation. If they're isolated for thousands of years or 100,000 years or a million years, that makes a big difference on whether they become two different species or not. Which is, by the way, why all humans are the same species, because we have constant gene flow between all human populations on the planet. So it's not possible for humans to become a different species, since were constantly sharing genes with one another. Even Neanderthal, we know that modern humans today have Neanderthal genes, and other species of human hominids, we have their genes in us, which suggests there was gene flow between those hominids and modern humans. So the idea that we could ever really become different species, it becomes difficult for humans because we move around so much, we interact with each other closely, and we have babies with each other all the time. So it's not possible. It's very difficult for us to become a completely different species. The size of the island is going to impact how many different. What does size have to do with it? It has to do with the number of niches. Space is one of those things that limits a population. So how much space is there? How many different kinds of spaces are there? Are there mountains? Are there valleys? Is there a freshwater lake? Or is it an island, a small island like this wouldn't even have any freshwater lake? Maybe there'd be some streams during the rain or ponds, but it would be very hard to find a freshwater source on a small island like this. Versus a larger island would have plenty of freshwater, waterfalls, and etc. The climate, is it an Arctic island versus a tropical one? A tropical island would be much more green, a lot more bigger food source, a wider type of food source, right? So there's going to be a lot of plant genetic variation, a lot of variation in the plant biota. So where an Arctic island would have less of that, and the growing season would be smaller. So it would be more difficult for land animals to survive in the Arctic versus on an Arctic island versus a tropical one. Arid versus humid. Arid would be more of a desert island. And if it's a desert island, that means less food source for animals, so less animals. You might find things like walruses or sea lions nesting on those on those desert islands, on those islands without any plant material, because again, there'd be a lot less predators for their eggs. They'd still have to look out for birds, but there'd be a lot less rats and a lot less lizards and snakes, because there wouldn't be a year-round source of food for them without those tropical conditions that would allow for a lot of plant growth. Because without plant growth, you can't have the foundational food source for the animals that live on the island. Are you near ocean currents? If you're near ocean currents, you're more likely to get an influx of new species, right? You're more likely to get a new type of turtle coming in, a lizard, a snake that's holding on to after some hurricane hit wherever they were originally. But they have to be able to follow those ocean currents. Those ocean currents, if the island is near an ocean current, then it's more likely that you're going to get a larger variation of animals. Initial plant animal composition, right? How many different kinds of plants and animals were there to begin with? Because the island could have been broken off from the continent, or could be a volcanic island, as we discussed earlier. The species composition of earliest arrivals. Was it always isolated? If it was always isolated, or was it broken off from the continent? If it was broken off from the continent, then you're going to have an initial plant-animal composition just like the continent. So if it broke off Africa, then the western tip of Africa, then it's going to have a lot of animals and plants that are very much like Africa, like that found on the continent, unless it's been isolated for a very long period of time. Madagascar is a really great example of a large island that was separated from the mainland that's on the eastern coast of Africa, separated from the mainland millions of years ago. And upon separation, they've been separated for long enough that you have a large variation of animals still related to those found on the eastern coast of Africa, but much more diversity because of it's a large island. It's relatively isolated, still close enough probably to have individuals come back and forth occasionally, isolated for millions of years since it broke off the continent. The climate's tropical. It's located near ocean currents. They had an initial plant and animal composition very much like that of off eastern Africa. And what are chance serendipity is chance luck. So that what you find on Madagascar, as most of you are familiar with it from the movies, the cartoons, what you find all that genetic variation because of these conditions that are found there on Madagascar. So when we look at Galapagos versus and Cape Verde, and you're asked, are both tropical islands close to both tropical islands are close to the equator, but their biotas are very different. Can you explain why? When you do that explanation, consider these factors, right? Go back, look at the other video, look at the map, go back on the previous page, look at the map of where these are found, and ask yourself, what about these? How do these impact that? How are these different between the Galapagos and Cape Verde? Because that's going to tell you why the biota are different. Explain why the majority of plant species found in Tristan da Cunha originate from South America, despite the greater distance from the island than Africa, right? So they could have gotten plant species from Africa. Why are they getting most from South America? And I believe I answered on the last video, so I'm not going to give you that answer now. But take a look at where you find Tristan da Cunha and read the reading and listen, or listen to the video, watch the video, and you'll see that there's a good reason why South America. And I would point towards this one, ocean currents. And to give a complete answer, you have to understand how ocean currents would impact this. All right. There's some factors influence composition of biota. Explain how each of the following might affect diversity, uniqueness, and biota found in an oceanic island. I think I've pretty much gone over this, but I'd like to read what you have to say about this. So I'd love it if you guys could just think about it and come up with your own specific examples. I've tried to stay general, so sometimes it's difficult to say things without giving away the answers. So hopefully I've stayed general enough that it allows you to think, but specific enough that it helped you explain what's going on. This is a very tricky maneuver to try to give you information over a video and try to give you some room for thinking and allow you to write your answers and express them here. But use your imagination. Try to consider all these factors, all the things I talked about, all the examples, and these factors that are listed here. And imagine how the size of the island, how large it is, a long period of isolation from other land masses, relatively close to the continental landmass. Describe how these might change the kind of life that exists on the island. Describe one feature typical of oceanic island colonizer and explain its significance. So think about a colonizer. I don't care if it's a giant tortoise or if it's a seabird, any one of these that you see up here. And ask yourself, what is one feature, one thing that the small seabirds or seabirds have that allows them to be an oceanic island colonizer? And why is that feature, why is that aspect of their existence, why is it important for them to become an oceanic island biota participant, right? So think about it. Why are these organisms, what is it that allows them to become a colonizer? I think the answer is obvious, so hopefully you'll be able to write that out fairly clearly. If it's not, you could always send me drop me a message on Jupiter Grades, and I'll try to send you some help. All right, have a good one. Again, try to stay socially isolated during this time. Remember to wash your hands, and this part of the unit's almost over. All right, have a good one.